So the theme for this week that we're going to be looking at is corporate strategy. And this first brief screencast will give you a basic introduction to the area of corporate strategy for sports organisations. So the first thing to be aware of is that we looked at this diagram a couple of weeks ago in week 8, and at that time our focus was down at the bottom here. And so we've looked at in recent weeks about how an organisation can achieve competitive advantage in a given industry through developing the right strengths, through acquiring the right resources, through doing things right, having the right processes. And this can give it a competitive advantage, and this is known within strategic management as business strategy or business level strategy. So, but organisations, when they're thinking about strategy, don't just have to ask, how should we compete? They've got to ask themselves an equally fundamental question, which is, which business should we be in? And so when an organisation is considering which business it should be in, it's really asking, are the businesses that we're in, are they currently attractive to us? Are we performing well in these areas? Or are there great opportunities, or can we exploit our strengths well in other industries which are attractive to us because of market forecast, or we believe that we have the right strengths to allow us to make headway in that market? And the question about which businesses should we be in falls into the sphere of corporate strategy in strategic management. So the next couple of slides, I just want to explore a little bit more about this question about what business should we be in and what corporate strategy actually involves. So corporate strategy does involve some challenges, and most businesses over time tend to move into new business areas to exploit new opportunities. As we will see later in this series of screencasts, some organisations take big leaps into areas of industry which are quite unrelated to the business that they're currently in, and they expand quite radically in that way, in a pretty inorganic way. But other organisations expand in a less risky way, in a more organic and gradual way, by expanding into areas of business that are closely related to areas that they currently operate in. But anyway, over time, most businesses that have been around for a while, and those businesses who seek to improve their profitability, and that really reflects on the commercial sector most in the sport industry, they will expand and move into new areas of business, and sometimes they will move out of current areas of business because they don't see that they are attractive, or they don't see that they have the right resources, the right competencies to actually compete effectively in those business areas. This is a little bit different for many sport organisations, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about national governing bodies and their corporate strategy. It's more difficult, isn't it, for a national governing body to actually move out of given areas and move into new unrelated areas, because its home territory, its core, is going to always be the sport which it governs, which it oversees. But we will still talk about how we can apply some of this thinking to national governing bodies and international sport federations as we move through this lecture. But the reasons that most businesses tend to move into new areas of business is that they believe that risks can be reduced and opportunities can be expanded by relying on more than one activity. In Screencast 2, we're going to look at something called portfolio management. And portfolio management says that organisations probably have a range of businesses which they operate. Okay, they're called strategic business units in portfolio analysis. And the idea is that by having a range of different businesses, you can spread your risks. Okay, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And excuse me if you're not familiar with the English term, but obviously, if you put all your eggs in one basket and you drop that basket, you know what's going to happen to your eggs. Yeah, and so that analogy holds for businesses who look to diversify and spread their risk across a number of different areas and different business areas, and we'll look at how they hope to have a balanced portfolio in Screencast 2. And as a result of this moving into new areas, the inevitable consequence is that organisations become more complex as operations spread across different countries, different territories, different regions, and quite often serve different customers or different market segments at least, offering different products or a wide range of different products. Okay, so that can increase complexity and make things more difficult to manage and sometimes more costly to manage. So it's worth remembering at this stage that the cost leadership approach in business level strategy says, keep things simple, don't offer lots of variety, don't spread yourself too much, because that can increase costs. And it's worth focusing on that issue of complexity, because there are risks with complexity which can increase costs, can reduce efficiency, and can increase bureaucracy and make it more difficult to be sure what is actually going on within a really big corporate complex business, and to make sure that things are being managed as well as they need to be. So we will talk about some examples of organisations who have expanded badly, and it's been a reason for their failure. And equally, we can point to organisations who have expanded and moved into new areas of business and done that successfully, and have grown to become big, strong businesses. So we will look at those. And corporate strategy really focuses on the strategic decisions involved in trying to manage this complexity. So, what are some of the key decisions in corporate strategy? Well, an organisation needs to decide which directions to develop in. Okay, and this obviously is where your external and internal analysis comes in, because it needs to understand where the opportunities and the threats lie, and it needs to understand how its strengths and weaknesses affect the way it can approach those opportunities and threats. But it needs to decide which directions to develop in. And I've said before, and we'll repeat again, that there are three basic directions. An organisation can stay where it is, stay in the business that it's currently in. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it can be lazy and it can just carry on as with business as usual. If it's staying in its current position, it's probably going to have to take steps and strategic actions to protect and build its current position within the markets it operates in. Because depending on industry conditions and Porter's five forces, it could be that, its competitive advantage is under threat through new entrants, and its competitive advantage is being eroded by other organisations getting better at what they do. So staying still and staying in the current business doesn't necessarily mean doing nothing. That can be a positive strategic decision. But as well as staying in the business that they're currently in, if the organisation decides that there are great opportunities and that it has the right strengths, or there are great opportunities and can overcome weaknesses, it may decide to move into new areas of business. Right? So as well as staying put, an organisation can move into new areas of business. And equally, if the organisation looks at its situation, it understands where it currently is, and it understands where the market is going, it thinks the market forecast is not good for some areas of its businesses, and it doesn't have the strength to be able to succeed in those particular markets, withdrawal or exit from a market might be the most appropriate action. So we will talk more about those later in this lecture. We will also talk about methods of development. So once the organisation has decided which direction should it move in, how should it move in that direction? And again, as with directions, where I said there are 3 directions to develop in, broadly speaking, and at a level of some abstraction and simplification, there are 3 methods that an organisation can use. It can use its own internal resources, the strengths that it currently has. It can, through strategic alliance and partnership, for a limited term or for a defined period of time or for a defined project, work with other organisations or another organisation in order to pool resources, to pool competencies, to make sure that the strengths are available to allow them to follow their strategic course of action which they decide. And finally, they may decide to kind of strengthen their current position in their current business or move into a new area of business through executing a merger or an acquisition or a takeover of another business that operates in the same market space as them. So methods of development as well is something that we will talk about, and we'll offer you more examples of that, both conceptual and real examples as we go through this lecture. And ultimately, the real decision then is how far to extend the scope of the business. How diversified should you become? Have you over-diversified, and do you need to simplify the structure and the range of businesses that you actually have within your organisation? Or do you need to, or is there a kind of imperative to increase the scope of your operations, the scope of your business areas, in order to minimise risks and in order to pursue great opportunities that might exist out there, which will allow you to exploit the resources, the strengths that you currently have. And the real acid test for how far to extend the scope of the business is, can the organisation create and manage synergies? And synergies is simply 2 + 2 = 5. So the sum of the parts is greater than the individual parts. And synergies is what organisations are trying to achieve as they develop corporations. So obviously we can see that through developing and increasing the size of the business, we may be able to improve economy of scale, which might give us a cost advantage, which might make us more efficient, which might drive down our costs and increase our profitability. It might give us opportunities to expand into, as we develop a global presence, to expand into new territories within different global regions. So there are clear opportunities associated with corporate strategy. But if we can't create synergy and manage synergies, then we can end up with overcomplicated organisations which are inefficient, where costs are difficult to control and manage, where management decision-making becomes complicated and difficult to make and difficult to enforce, and that as a result, efficiency and effectiveness decreases, business performance decreases, and this can lead to strategic failure, quite often because a lot of businesses expand through borrowing money, essentially, whether that's on money markets or through issuing shares or other forms of borrowing. They become quite highly leveraged or leveraged in the hope that they can generate more business through buying out other businesses and improve profitability, but then are unable to repay some of their borrowings and end up in financial trouble. Okay, so those are some of the key areas in corporate strategy for us to consider. Now, what I want to talk about first and in the next screencast as we move into looking in this in more detail is which directions to develop in.